Welcome back here on SportsLine. Steve Lehman with you tonight. We're joined now by Andrew Maraniss, the author of the book Strong Inside. Andrew, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
Absolutely. Good to have you here. Strong Inside is a terrific book. I think some people may know that it's the Perry Wallace story, the first black basketball player in the SEC at Vanderbilt back in 1967. Tell me how you got, that's not your era, so tell me how you first learned of the story and got interested in this project.
Yeah, well, it was 26 years ago. I was a 19-year-old sophomore at Vanderbilt, 1989, and was at Vandy on a sports writing scholarship, was a history major, and happened to read a student magazine article about Perry Wallace's first game at Mississippi State. And this article just described the scene, the brutal racism that he encountered in the first half of the game and what it took for him just to survive in that atmosphere. And that really struck me as somebody that was interested in sports and history. So I wrote some papers about him as a college student and then came back to it 8 years ago and decided to write this book.
Yeah, an 8-year project to get the book Strong Inside out and published and on bookshelves where people can go out and purchase it. What did you find out in doing the book, and at what point did you actually meet Perry along the way?
Right. Well, when I was a student, I never met him. I just interviewed him over the telephone. He was a professor in Baltimore. I ended up meeting him a few years after that. He was honored at an SEC basketball tournament in Atlanta, and I saw him waiting for a bus along with the other legends to be taken over to the Georgia Dome, and went up and introduced myself to him. But, you know, over the course of the 8 years working on the book, I interviewed him dozens of times, either in person or on the phone or through email, and it was a great friendship that developed, you know, along with the reporting to put this book together.
Take me back to the beginning, because Perry Wallace was a Nashville kid. He was a terrific basketball player at Pearl High School, which everybody knows the great 1965 game against Father Ryan, and then the next year Pearl won the first ever integrated state basketball title. He was a star of that team in 1966. He had a lot of choices to go to college, not just in the South. How did he end up going to Vanderbilt and becoming a trailblazer in this civil rights movement?
Sure. Well, growing up in Nashville in the South in the 50s and 60s, Perry Wallace's goal was to use basketball as a means to an end, as a way out of segregation, out of the South. He was recruited by schools in the Big Ten, many schools in the Big Ten, Michigan, Wisconsin, Northwestern, Iowa, by John Wooden at UCLA.
That's hard to say no to.
Yeah, exactly. But you know what made him say no was on his recruiting visits, he saw something that he didn't like. And you still see it too often today. He was offered cash to go to many of these schools. He was told, don't worry about going to class, or we'll find the easiest classes for you. And Perry was a serious student. He wasn't just a great basketball player. He was a valedictorian of his class at Pearl High School. And so that really turned him off. And it was on his recruiting trips to Vanderbilt where he saw players going to class. He was impressed with the engineering department, and so actually he decided to come to Vanderbilt really in spite of the fact that he'd be a pioneer rather than because of it, mainly because he knew he could play big-time college basketball and get a great education, and those are the two things he wanted.
When he went around the SEC as a player, he saw all sorts of things that I think all of us would like to forget was a time in our society. Was Vanderbilt, was the campus on West End, was Nashville ready for a guy like Perry Wallace to break through and be the first black basketball player and a high-profile person on that campus?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. But as you mentioned, the road trips really, Perry told me he would look at the schedule before the season started with the deepest sense of dread, you know, and thinking about going to Starkville and Oxford and Auburn and Tuscaloosa. And he was afraid he'd get shot and killed, either on the court or around town before a game. And that's not too surprising when you think about the atmosphere in the Deep South in the mid to late 1960s. But, you know, the campus environment here in Nashville wasn't all easy for him either. He did have some pockets of support. There were some students that were supportive of him being there. The Chancellor, Alexander Hurd, was. University chaplain was. There were some professors that were great with Perry, would have him out to his house. But he encountered a lot of loneliness on campus. You know, the Greek system was entirely segregated still at the time. He would have dorm hall mates that would slam the door as he came walking down the hall. His best friend, who was African-American from Pearl, his first day of English class, the professor greets him with the N-word. Perry was kicked out of a church right across the street from campus before his first day of class as a freshman. So, you know, it was no easy thing for him, even here in Nashville and on the Vanderbilt campus.
Did that change at all as he got more popularity and clearly became a star on the basketball floor?
Yeah, it changed both on the road and on campus. He said by his junior and senior year, he didn't have these same fears as he went on the road, mainly because many of the other schools were starting to integrate also, at least in football. Auburn was the only school that integrated in basketball while Perry was playing. But you started to have fans at these schools that had their own black players, and so they weren't harassing Perry so much. On campus, his senior year, he was voted Bachelor of Ugliness, which is the award they used to give to the basically the most popular male student on campus. And his teammates, his senior year, he said he got along better with them than any he had his entire career.
When you talk about the teammates, they weren't used to having a black player there either. How did they adjust during his time on campus, and how were they supportive in some ways of what he was doing?
Sure. Well, Coach Skinner at the time recruited most of his players from outside the South. A lot of these guys came from Missouri, Indiana, Kentucky, Illinois, states that had already integrated. So many of them played with African Americans in high school. Playing with Perry wasn't particularly unusual for them, but in some ways that was not so helpful to Perry. They felt, you know, this is no big deal. Yet when he's going down to on these road trips, it was quite a big deal. And so oftentimes, Jackie Robinson's story, you hear about the incident where Pee Wee Reese puts his arm around Jackie Robinson in the face of the worst heckling to kind of show the crowd, I've got this guy's back, leave him alone. Perry never had any sort of visible support like that from a teammate. Coach Skinner never sat the team down and said, this is going to be hard for our teammate. We need to you know, really have his back and show support for him here. And so he really felt like, at least on the road trips, you know, it was him really all by himself dealing with these crowds.
You talked about, or I've heard you talk before about a certain environment at Ole Miss in a game that they played down there, and just how wild the crowd was, and really some of the measures friends and student trainers and things like that had to take to just keep them safe down there. And that was a fairly common thing, wasn't it?
Yes. Well, Perry's freshman year, back then they had freshman teams and varsity teams. Ole Miss cancels both of its games against Vanderbilt rather than play against the team that was integrated. So his sophomore year is the first time an African American has played in Oxford against Ole Miss. First half of the game, Perry takes an elbow to the face. He's bleeding. He's temporarily blinded in an eye. The refs don't call a foul. They don't whistle a stop to the game. It's not till the next dead ball that the team manager and trainer are able to come out to treat Perry. And as they do, the crowd rises in cheers as they walk him across the court to the Vanderbilt locker room. And, you know, that type of thing didn't happen all the time, but, you know, that shows you the type of environment that Perry faced on the road. And one thing I think you heard me mention was that, you know, there were pockets even of fans there that were supportive of Perry. The Vanderbilt team manager was from Jackson, Mississippi. He had friends that were going to school at Ole Miss, and he got a number of them to sit in the first couple of rows behind the Vanderbilt bench to try to create a little bit of a buffer zone to protect Perry from the worst elements of the crowd. But I talked to one of those guys. He said it quickly became apparent that their little buffer zone was really not going to help, unfortunately.
From talking to Perry and from what you know of all these stories, how was he particularly suited to handle all of this? Because it always amazes me. He was a really good player, which I think he probably had to be able to break through like that. But also his temperament must have been something special to go through everything that he did and encounter all of the hate and the naysayers and really shrug it off and just continue on the path towards his mission. Had to be very remarkable for a young man at the time, 18, 19, 20 years old.
Absolutely, and that's one reason why the book is called Strong Inside. You know, it's a double meaning of him being a strong inside basketball player, but also just the incredible character and courage and strength that he has inside as a person. If you meet him, it takes you 5 seconds to realize that. He's an incredibly charismatic and strong and smart, sensitive guy. In high school, as I mentioned, he was a valedictorian. He came from a family where, you know, their faith was very important to him. He studied pioneers even before he became one himself, had read about Jackie Robinson, and would ask himself in certain situations, what's the proper pioneer response to this situation? You know, and it usually came down to, don't let these people get to you, and you cannot quit. You know, he recognized the importance of the mission he was on and would do whatever it took to survive that and succeed with it, keep his pioneering mission on track.
we just showed the book. Maybe we can pop that up again. The book is Strong Inside. The author is Andrew Maraniss. You can check it out at the website, www.andrewmaraniss.com. Or any other places where people can readily find this book? If
Yeah, they can find it in Nashville at bookstores all over town, and they can find it on the major online retailers as well. But I encourage you to get it at a local bookstore here in Nashville.
Sure, it's one of the best sellers, a great read as well. Andrew Maraniss is our guest. We have to take a break. We will come back and talk more about Strong Inside as SportsLine continues here on News Channel 5+.